Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be reading from the Transcendent Function by C.G. Jung. This is from Volume 8 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, published by Princeton University Press, The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche. This volume includes synchronicity and several other useful essays like psychic energy. But this is the Transcendent Function as requested by the Monday evening reading group. We meet every Monday night at 8 p.m. To discuss Dr. Jung's works. Today I'm going to read the first part of this essay. It's quite long, so I will read the first 10 pages of it, and tomorrow I'll do my best to read the next 20 pages of it. But just to get you started, this is part 1 of the Transcendent Function. Prefatory note. This essay was written in 1916. Recently it was discovered by students at the C.G. Jung Institute, Zurich, and was brought out in a private edition in its first provisional form in an English translation. In order to prepare it for publication, I have worked over the manuscript while preserving the main trend of thought and the unavoidable limitedness of its horizon. After 42 years, the problem has lost nothing of its topicality, though its presentation is still in need of extensive improvement, as anyone can see who knows the material. The essay may therefore stand, with all its imperfections, as an historical document. It may give the reader some idea of the efforts of understanding which were needed for the first attempts at a synthetic view of the psychic process in analytical treatment. As its basic argument is still valid today, it may stimulate the reader to a broader and deeper understanding of the problem. This problem is identical with the universal question, how does one come to terms in practice with the unconscious? And this republication was done in 1953. Reading on, this is Dr. Jung's preface. This is the question posed by the philosophy of India, and particularly by Buddhism and Zen. Indirectly, it is the fundamental question in practice of all religions and all philosophies. For the unconscious is not this thing or that. It is the unknown as it immediately affects us. The method of active imagination, hereinafter described, is the most important auxiliary for the production of those contents of the unconscious which lie, as it were, immediately below the threshold of consciousness, and when intensified, are the most likely to erupt spontaneously into the conscious mind. The method, therefore, is not without its dangers and should, if possible, not be employed except under expert supervision. One of the lesser dangers is that the procedure may not lead to any positive result, since it easily passes over into the so-called free association of Freud, whereupon the patient gets caught in the sterile circle of his own complexes, from which he is in any case unable to escape. A further danger, in itself harmless, is that, though authentic contents may be produced, the patient evinces an exclusively aesthetic interest in them, and consequently remains stuck in all-enveloping phantasmagoria, so that once more nothing is gained. The meaning and value of these fantasies are revealed only through their integration into the personality as a whole. That is to say, at the moment when one is confronted not only with what they mean, but also with their moral demands. Finally, a third danger, and this may in certain circumstances be a very serious matter, is that the subliminal contents already possess such a high energy charge that, when afforded an outlet by active imagination, they may overpower the conscious mind and take possession of the personality. This gives rise to a condition which, temporarily at least, cannot easily be distinguished from schizophrenia and may even lead to a genuine psychotic interval. The method of active imagination, therefore, is not a plaything for children. The prevailing undervaluation of the unconscious adds considerably to the dangers of this method. On the other hand, there can be no doubt that it is an invaluable auxiliary for the psychotherapist. Kusnak, July 1958 and September 1959, C.G. Jung. So that's the preface. Now that you're duly warned, active imagination is what Dr. Jung was doing heavily in the Red Book period. And so the Red Book contains his personal active imagination. It would not necessarily be what you would experience. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to read the essay in proper. Paragraph 131. There's nothing mysterious or metaphysical about the term transcendent function. It means a psychological function comparable in its way to a mathematical function of the same name, which is a function of real and imaginary numbers. The psychological transcendent function arises from the union of conscious and unconscious contents. Experience in analytical psychology has amply shown that the conscious and the unconscious seldom agree as to their contents and their tendencies. This lack of parallelism is not just accidental or purposeless, but is due to the fact that the unconscious behaves in a compensatory or complementary manner toward the conscious. We can also put it the other way round and say that the conscious behaves in a complementary manner toward the unconscious. The reasons for this relationship are: 1. Consciousness possesses a threshold intensity which its contents must have attained, so that all elements that are too weak remain in the unconscious. 2. Consciousness, because of its direct functions, exercises an inhibition, which Freud calls censorship, on all incompatible material, with the result that it sinks into the unconscious. 3. Consciousness constitutes the momentary process of adaptation, whereas the unconscious contains not only all the forgotten material of the individual's own past, but all the inherited behavior traces constituting the structure of the mind. 4. The unconscious contains all the fantasy combinations which have not yet attained the threshold intensity, but which in the course of time and under suitable conditions will enter the light of consciousness. This readily explains the complementary attitude of the unconscious toward the conscious. The definiteness and directedness of the conscious mind are qualities that have been acquired relatively late in the history of the human race, and are, for instance, largely lacking among primitives today. These qualities are often impaired in the neurotic patient, who differs from the normal person in that his threshold of consciousness gets shifted more easily. In other words, the partition between conscious and unconscious is much more permeable. The psychotic, on the other hand, is under the direct influence of the unconscious. The definiteness and directedness of the conscious mind are extremely important acquisitions which humanity has bought at a very heavy sacrifice, and which in turn have rendered the humanity the highest service. Without them, science, technology, and civilization would be impossible. For they all presuppose the reliable continuity and directedness of the conscious process. For the statesman, doctor, and engineer, as well as for the simplest laborer, these qualities are absolutely indispensable. We may say in general that social worthlessness increases to the degree that these qualities are impaired by the unconscious. Great artists and other distinguished by creative gifts are, of course, exceptions to this rule. The very advantage that such individuals enjoy consists precisely in the permeability of the partition separating the conscious and the unconscious. But for those professions and social activities which require just this continuity and reliability, these exceptional human beings are, as a rule, of little value. It is therefore understandable and even necessary that in each individual the psychic process should be as stable and definite as possible, since the exigencies of life demand it. But this involves a certain disadvantage. The quality of directedness makes for the inhibition or exclusion of all those psychic elements which appear to be or really are incompatible with it, i.e., likely to bias the intended direction to suit their purpose and to lead to an undesired goal. But how do we know that the concurrent psychic material is incompatible? We know it by an act of judgment, which determines the direction of the path that is chosen and desired. This judgment is partial and prejudiced, since it chooses one particular possibility at the cost of all others. The judgment, in its turn, is always based on experience, i.e., what is already known. As a rule, it is never based on what is new, what is still unknown, and what, under certain conditions, might considerably enrich the directed process. It is evident that it cannot be for the very reason that the unconscious contents are excluded from consciousness. Through such acts of judgment, the directed process necessarily becomes one-sided, even though the rational judgment may appear many-sided and unprejudiced. The very rationality of the judgment may even be the worst prejudice, since we call reasonable what appears reasonable to us. What appears to us unreasonable is therefore doomed to be excluded because of its irrational character. It may really be irrational, but may equally well merely appear irrational without actually being so when seen from another standpoint. One-sidedness is an unavoidable and necessary characteristic of the directed process, for direction implies one-sidedness. It is an advantage and a drawback at the same time, even when no outwardly visible drawback seems to be present. There is always an equally pronounced counterposition in the unconscious, unless it happens to be the ideal case where all the psychic components are tending in one and the same direction. This possibility cannot be disputed in theory, but in practice it very rarely happens. The counterposition in the unconscious is not dangerous so long as it does not possess any high energy value. But if the tension increases as a result of too great one-sidedness, the counter-tendency breaks through into consciousness, usually just at the moment when it is most important to maintain the conscious direction, Thus, the speaker makes a slip of the tongue just when he particularly wishes not to say anything stupid. This moment is critical because it possesses a high energy tension, which, when the unconscious is already charged, may easily spark and release the unconscious content. I'm up to paragraph 139 right now. Civilized life today demands concentrated, directed, conscious functioning, and this entails the risk of a considerable dissociation from the unconscious. The further we are able to remove ourselves from the unconscious through directed functioning, the more readily a powerful counterposition can build up in the unconscious, and when this breaks out, it may have disagreeable consequences. Analysis has given us a profound insight into the importance of unconscious influences, and we have learned so much from this for our practical life that we deem it unwise to expect an elimination or standstill of the unconscious after the so-called completion of the treatment. Many patients, obscurely recognizing the state of affairs, have great difficulty in deciding to give up the analysis, although both they and the analyst find the feeling of dependency irksome. Often they are afraid to risk standing on their own feet because they know from experiences that the unconscious can intervene again and again in their lives in a disturbing and apparently unpredictable manner. It was formerly assumed that patients were ready to cope with normal life as soon as they acquired enough practical self-knowledge to understand their own dreams. Experience has shown, however, that even professional analysts who might be expected to have mastered the art of dream interpretation often capitulate before their own dreams and have to call in help of a colleague. If even one who purports to be an expert in the method proves unable to interpret his own dreams satisfactorily, how much less can this be expected of the patient? Freud's hopes that the unconscious could be exhausted has not been fulfilled. Dream life and intrusions from the unconscious continue, mutatis mutandis, unimpeded. There is a widespread prejudice that analysis is something like a cure to which one submits for a time and is then discharged healed. That is a layman's error left over from the early days of psychoanalysis. Analytical treatment could be described as a readjustment of psychological attitude achieved with the help of the doctor. Naturally, this newly won attitude, which is better suited to the inner and outer conditions, can last a considerable time, but there are very few cases where a single cure is permanently successful. It is true that medical optimism has never stinted itself of publicity and has always been able to report definitive cures. We must, however, not let ourselves be deceived by the all-too-human attitude of the practitioner, but should always remember that the life of the unconscious goes on and continually produces problematic situations. There is no need for pessimism. We have seen too many excellent results achieved with good luck and honest work for that. But this need not prevent us from recognizing that analysis is not once and for all cure. It is no more at first than a more or less thorough readjustment. There is no change that is unconditionally valid over a long period of time. Life is always to be tackled anew. There are, of course, extremely durable collective attitudes which permit the solution of typical conflicts. A collective attitude enables the individual to fit into society without friction, since it acts upon him like any other condition of life. But the patient's difficulty consists precisely in the fact that his individual problem cannot be fitted without friction into a collective norm. It requires the solution of an individual conflict by the whole, if the whole of his personality is to remain viable. No rational solution can do justice to this task, and there is absolutely no collective norm that could replace an individual solution without loss. The attitude gained in the course of analysis tends sooner or later to become inadequate in one way or another, and necessarily so because the constant flow of life again and again demands fresh adaptation. Adaptation is never achieved once and for all. One might certainly demand of analysis that it should enable the patient to gain new orientations in later life, too, without undue difficulty. The experience shows that this is true up to a point. We often find that patients who have gone through a thorough analysis have considerably less difficulty with new adjustments later on. Nevertheless, these difficulties prove to be fairly frequent and may at times be really troublesome. That is why even patients who have had a thorough analysis often turn to their old analyst for help at some later period. In the light of medical practice in general, there is nothing very unusual about this, but it does contradict a certain misplaced enthusiasm on the part of the therapist, as well as the view that analysis constitutes a unique cure. In the last resort, it is highly improbable that there could ever be a therapy that got rid of all difficulties. Man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health. What concerns us here is only an excessive amount of them. The basic question for the therapist is not how to get rid of the momentary difficulty, but how future difficulties may be successfully countered. The question is, what kind of mental and moral attitude is it necessary to have toward the disturbing influences of the unconscious, and how can it be conveyed to the patients? Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Mallory, Sean, Martin, good to see you. Okay, I'll go with your questions for a moment. The other day you used the word pedantic for starting with writer's block, and I thought that was the perfect word to use. Well, thank you. And Miles says, something normal with a little introspection can be realized to be not normal. Do we unconsciously know that the electric light is not normal, given we are a creature of 200,000 years? Well, we're actually a creature of 3.5 billion years. So, but do we know that it's not normal? I guess if we think about it. And then Miles says, someone who went about breaking all of our light bulbs would be the one called insane. Yes, you're right about that. But that's adaptation to society, Miles. So we have to adapt if we're going to live in the modern world. And this is the fundamental point here between the unconscious and the conscious, because the unconscious has developed over 3.5 billion years. And so it has a certain opinion about what you should be doing at any given moment, but it doesn't have to live in the 21st century. You do. And your unconscious stopped evolving at the time you were born. And so this is the significance of the verse in First John, the first letter of John 4:1, which says you must test the spirits because your unconscious is constantly delivering to you psychic energy that you need to use one way or another, and it's up to your ego to decide whether the ideas that come up from your unconscious are appropriate for the 21st century or not. They might be appropriate for the 12th century BC or even earlier. So that's the issue. Hi, Vincent. Nice to see you. So anyway, carrying on. So I think I read this paragraph already, but I'll read it once again. The basic question for the therapist is not how to get rid of the momentary difficulty, but how future difficulties may be successfully countered. The question is, what kind of mental or moral attitude is it necessary to have toward the disturbing influences of the unconscious, and how can it be conveyed to the patient? The answer obviously consists in getting rid of the separation between conscious and unconscious. This cannot be done by condemning the contents of the unconscious in a one-sided way, but rather by recognizing their significance in compensating the one-sidedness of consciousness, and by taking this significance into account. The tendencies of the conscious and the unconscious are the two factors that together make up the transcendent function. It is called transcendent because it makes the transition from one attitude to another organically possible without loss of the unconscious. The constructive or synthetic method of treatment presupposes insights which are at least potentially present in the patient and can therefore be made conscious. If the analyst knows nothing of these potentialities, he cannot help the patient to develop them either, unless analyst and patient together devote proper scientific study to this problem, which as a rule is out of the question. In actual practice, therefore, the suitably trained analyst mediates the transcendent function for the patient, i.e., helps him to bring conscious and unconscious together and so arrive at a new attitude. In this function of the analyst lies one of the many important meanings of the transference. The patient clings by means of the transference to the person who seems to promise him a renewal of the attitude. Through it, he seeks this change, which is vital to him, even though he may not be conscious of doing so. For the patient, therefore, the analyst has the character of an indispensable figure absolutely necessary for life. However infantile this dependence may appear to be, it expresses an extremely important demand which, if disappointed, often turns to bitter hatred of the analyst. It is therefore important to know what this demand concealed in the transference is really aiming at. There is a tendency to understand it in the reductive sense only, as an erotic infantile fantasy, but that would mean taking this fantasy, which is usually concerned with the parents, literally as though the patient, or rather his unconscious, still had the expectations the child once had toward the parents. Outwardly, it still is the same expectation of the child for the help and protection of the parents, but in the meantime, the child has become an adult, and what was normal for a child is improper in an adult. It has become a metaphorical expression of the not consciously realized need for help in a crisis. Historically, it is correct to explain the erotic character of the transference in terms of the infantile eros, but in that way, the meaning and purpose of the transference are not understood, and its interpretation as an infantile sexual fantasy leads away from the real problem. The understanding of the transference is to be sought not in its historical antecedents, but in its purpose. The one-sided reductive explanation becomes in the end nonsensical, especially when absolutely nothing new comes out of it except the increased resistances of the patient. The sense of boredom which then appears in the analysis is simply an expression of the monotony and poverty of ideas, not of the unconscious, as is sometimes supposed, but of the analyst who does not understand that these fantasies should not be taken merely as concretistic, reductive sense, but rather in a constructive one. When this is realized, the standstill is often overcome at a single stroke. Constructive treatment of the unconscious, that is, the question of meaning and purpose, paves the way for the patient's insight into that process, which I call the transcendent function. It may not be superfluous at this point to say a few words about the frequently heard objection that the constructive method is simply suggestion. The method is based rather on evaluating the symbol, i.e., dream image or fantasy, not semiotically as a sign for elementary instinctual processes, but symbolically in the true sense, the word symbol being taken to mean the best possible expression for a complex fact not yet clearly apprehended by consciousness. And so what I want to point out here before I go on with this is that what happens is if there's one position and then another position, which is typical of neurosis, one side or another side. In politics, we can see it in the American red state, blue state duality. That's a neurosis. And the solution to that is a symbol. So it's a thesis, an antithesis, not saying which side is right or wrong, but one side has one position, one side the other, or a husband and a wife. Husband has one point of view, wife has another. And it's not that either one is incorrect, but the way to get the solution is by learning what the symbol says. And the symbol, which is the synthesis, it may not come in words, it might not be describable in words, but the synthesis presents itself as the solution. And so if we mix red and blue, what we get is purple. Now, once you have that purple, then immediately another side will peel off from that, and then you'll start to have maybe lighter purple on one side and pink on the other or something like that, and then you'll have another thesis and antithesis, and that will result in yet another symbol, and maybe that'll be a lighter color purple. I don't know. I mean, I'm just free associating here, but the point is that the symbol is an image that your psyche, your unconscious, presents to solve a problem. And so in the political sense, in the collective unconscious of the United States of America, every 2 years we have an election, and every 4 years we have a presidential election. So there's a thesis and antithesis, and then the synthesis is the election of the president, which hopefully we all support as Americans. Sometimes that works better, sometimes not so much. But the point is that the symbol is presented by the unconscious through dreams and visions, and that symbol is the synthesis between thesis and antithesis. And that's the case with psychic problems, which is what Dr. Jung is trying to get to here in terms of the transcendent function. So it's the function that gets what's unconscious to cooperate with what's conscious. And so anyway, through reductive analysis of this expression, nothing is gained but a clear view of the elements originally composing it. And though I would not deny that increased insight into these elements may have its advantages, it nevertheless bypasses the question of purpose. Dissolution of the symbol at this stage of analysis is therefore a mistake. To begin with, however, the method for working out the complex meanings suggested by the symbol is the same as in reductive analysis. The associations of the patient are obtained, and as a rule, they are plentiful enough to be used in the synthetic method. Here again, they are evaluated not semiotically, but symbolically. The question we must ask is, to what meaning do the individual associations A, B, C point when taken in conjunction with the manifest dream content? Let me go back and look. Miles says, humanity makes many grievous mistakes because so many are living without seeking transcendence, and to stop going along to get along, staying stunted or in arrested development of self. Yes, I agree with that. Sean says, what is the symbolism of a black uncoiled snake? I saw the image flash to me when I was talking to a very intelligent woman. She was very beautiful and dangerous. Well, Sean, I couldn't tell you the answer to that because I would need to know many more facts that are going on. And so this is why it's always best if you try to tell yourself what it means. I mean, you need to go back and reflect on the meaning of that symbol to you in the circumstance. You know, I've previously read from my book of symbols. I have this lovely book of symbols that has long descriptions of all kinds of symbols, but they may not have any meaning with respect to your vision. Mallory says, I am curious if Skip has read Neil Postman's books on technology's effect on culture. The answer to the question, Mallory, is no. And Mallory's suggestion then to Sean is to dialogue with the snake. That would be an act of imagination, and it would be, that's a good idea. I mean, I could get my book of symbols and just prove to you that it may not have anything to do with your situation, Sean. Mariana says, is the transcendent function autonomous? Yes, it certainly is. Hold on a second. Because I have this book of symbols. Okay, so this is the official book of symbols published by Taschen. And let's see if I can find a snake in here. I probably can with no problem at all. But it is very likely that it won't have anything to do with you. But here's one. There's several. There's several here, but one is Snake Goddess, 548 and 49. So let's. Well, that ain't it. I did get the snake goddess. There she is. but the write-up is about an apron, so that's not it. Snake, 194 to 197. Okay. All right, so here's snake. All right. And just to prove to you, I'll just read to you this definition, or this is the write-up on snake. Now, mind you, the reason I'm doing this is because this book, the Book of Symbols, was written by Jungian analysts who all cracked their brain as much as they could to come up with all the associations that come from snake. But in my experience, these things very rarely actually touch the meaning I'm looking for. Let's see, Joseph Campbell says, Sean, perhaps a symbol your unconscious sends from your anima projection. Yes, that would be that's a true statement, but the meaning of it is doesn't come from that. And Vincent says, does anima possession give a distorted view of obstacles and impair the transcendent function? I would say that yes, that's very likely, but again, because I'm not a mental health professional, I can only give you my opinion. Whether it's worth anything, I don't know. But let me read you about snake here. There is no such thing as a singing snake. The sound of a hiss or rattle, noticed to the unwary one, the snake's presence, and sometimes an ominous warning, strikes terror in many. Emily Dickinson expresses this fear eloquently. Quote, but never met this fellow attended or alone, without a tighter breathing, and zero at the bone. A narrow fellow in the grass is the name of the poem. Okay. Arms raised in awe and holding a stick or wand in his left hand, an ithyphallic male faces an enormous sinuous snake, a serpentine line of eternally undulating cosmic energy. The erect phallus of the human mirrors the raised head of the snake. A numinous encounter with or magical invocation of the serpent as emblematic primordial life force. We can almost sense the quickening of the man's breath, the zero at the bone, as he meets this elemental spirit, emerging with S-shaped movements from primal water, spiraling or coiling on itself like the DNA in every living cell, striking out at lightning speed or deftly slithering away on its limbless belly and vanishing in a flash. The snake enters our mythologies as cosmic creator, progenitor, destroyer, and sacred being. How eerie a snake can seem. It smells with its flickering, forked tongue. It hears through its skin and is particularly sensitive to low-frequency vibrations and tremblings of the earth, linking it with secret subterranean oracular mysteries of knowledge. The snake sees through lidless eyes covered by a transparent scale, never blinking, evoking a supernatural vigilance, like the cobra protectively encircling the brow of the Egyptian pharaoh, or the eye of the unconscious psyche that sees where consciousness cannot, or the mesmerizing eye of the legendary hero, or the unflinching eye of death. When the snake withdraws to shed its skin, signifying renewal, rebirth, and immortality, the eye scale becomes milky and sometimes taking on an ethereal misty blue cast, as though the serpent is entering a meditative state and has access to wisdom beyond our ken. Heat-sensitive infrared radar allows some species of snake to track their prey unerringly in the dark. The jaw of the python unhinges, allowing it to ingest whole prey many times its size. These uncanny associate the snake with the relentless, death-dealing aspect of nature, or with the instinctual psyche and its sudden and unexpected manifestations, its painful and dangerous interventions in our affairs, and its frightening effects. The snake's gender is determined by the temperature of its surroundings during gestation. Males have split hemipenes, a forked penis. The females have a split clitoris, relating these parts to the tongue and the imagery of paradisal seduction and the creative word, as well as sexuality. Its unmistakable phallic shape, combined with its habit of copulating for days or even weeks, either with one snake or with 50, has identified the snake with active, penetrating phallic energy, fertility, and potency. The wild braid of creation, poet Stanley Kunitz called an entwined pair of snakes hanging from a tree in his garden. Okay, there's more here, but you get the idea. And so here's another page of it with pictures. But the problem is, this sounds very Freudian because it sounds like free association, and so reading a book of symbols like that might give you some ideas. I'm not saying it wouldn't, but the way this is written sounds like free association, and so you yourself have to apply the meaning to such a book, and that's about the best I can say on that. So Mallory says symbols are typically extremely subjective from my experience. Yes, so symbols relate to you, and nobody can tell you what your symbols mean. You know, even the analyst can give you a bunch of ideas, but you're the one that has to decide. And Sean says, yeah, that's my predisposition, and it has left me wondering. My read is that it would be the death of me, but I don't honestly know. You just have to keep asking yourself until you do know. Mallory says, well, that does sound a lot like a lot of Western women. I'm not going to touch that one. Martin, maybe it was your intention picking up the way the woman was speaking. Snakes also related to wisdom, so you say she was dangerous, then a snake would be a good image, perhaps. Sean says she had an element of charming allure, which I sensed as danger. Martin, Sanki would be perfect then, or snake would be perfect then. Miles, this might strike people as funny, but my image is not as dramatic as the snake, rather than the moose is. The moose is the recurring animal in my life. Mallory laughs. Okay, all right, so I have to finish this essay, though. I'm going to finish this essay on the transcendent function. So, okay, and so it so happens that I'm right at a point where there's a reference to a woman's dreams, and I'm going to read the footnote, which is on the following page, where Dr. Jung is giving 3 different discussions of this dream, and that will be near the end of this presentation tonight, and then I'll try tomorrow to do part 2 of this essay. So, paragraph 149. An unmarried woman patient dreamt that someone gave her a wonderful, richly ornamented antique sword dug up out of a tumulus. And so that's the dream. Somebody gave her a very richly ornamented antique sword. In this case, there was no need of any supplementary analogies on the part of the analyst. The patient's associations provided all that was necessary. It might be objected that this treatment of the dream involves suggestion, but this ignores the fact that a suggestion is never accepted without an inner readiness for it, or if after great insistence it is accepted, it is immediately lost again. A suggestion that is accepted for any length of time always presupposes a marked psychological readiness, which is merely brought into play by the so-called suggestion. The objection is therefore thoughtless and credits suggestion with a magical power it in no way possesses. Otherwise, suggestion therapy would have an enormous effect and would render analytical procedures quite superfluous. But this is far from being the case. Furthermore, the charge of suggestion does not take account of the fact that the patient's own associations point to the cultural significance of the sword. And so now I will read the 3 columns that are in the footnote here, which is the interpretation of the dream from paragraph 149. Okay, so first are the associations. Her father's dagger, which he once flashed in the sun in front of her, it made a great impression on her. Her father was in every respect an energetic, strong-willed man with an impetuous temperament and adventurous in love affairs. A Celtic bronze sword. Patient is proud of her Celtic ancestry. The Celts are full of temperament, impetuous, passionate. The ornamentation has a mysterious look about it. Ancient tradition, runes, signs of ancient wisdom, ancient civilization, heritage of mankind, brought to light again out of the grave. Okay, so that was the associations that she had. Next column, analytical interpretation. Patient has a pronounced father complex with a rich tissue of sexual fantasies about her father, whom she lost early. She always put herself in her mother's place, although with strong resistances toward her father. She has never been able to accept a man like her father, and has therefore chosen weakly, neurotic men against her will. Also in the analysis, violent resistances toward the physician father. The dream digs up her wish for her father's weapon. The rest is clear. In theory, this would immediately point to a phallic fantasy. And then the third column, it reads, constructive interpretation. It is as if the patient needed such a weapon. Her father had the weapon. He was energetic, lived accordingly, and also took upon himself the difficulties inherent in his temperament. Therefore, though living a passionate, exciting life, he was not neurotic. This weapon is a very ancient heritage of mankind, which lay buried in the patient and was brought to light through excavation, analysis. The weapon has to do with insight, with wisdom. It is a means of attack and defense. Her father's weapon was a passionate, unbending will with which he made his way through life. Up till now, the patient, and I think that's the end of that column, and then there's across the bottom of this footnote down here, there's a general statement. Up till now, the patient has been the opposite in every respect. She is just on the point of realizing that a person can also will something and need not merely be driven as she had always believed. The will based on a knowledge of life and on insight is an ancient heritage of the human race, which also is in her, but till now lay buried, for in this respect, too, she is her father's daughter. But she had not appreciated this till now, because her character had been that of a perpetually whining, pampered, spoiled child. She was extremely passive and completely given to sexual fantasies. Okay, so that's the end of that dream interpretation. And so tomorrow I am going to go on with paragraph 151, which begins with this sentence. After this digression, let us return to the question of the transcendent function. So yes, let's. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make about this symbol book is that Dr. Freud believed in free association. And Dr. Jung observed over time that if you just allow free association, ultimately you end up with the entire life of your patient and also everything in the universe. You can free associate to everything there is. And so Dr. Jung was more interested in the relationship between the conscious and unconscious mind. And the point I was trying to make with this book of symbols, which, as you can see, is a quite big book. It's a couple inches thick. And I think it was about $50 at Barnes & Noble, if I recall. My wife gave it for Christmas one year. But in general, I do not find that the symbol descriptions in here almost ever point to anything that's useful to me with one of my dreams. Almost never. Just to give you an example, which you may have heard, which is that we looked up the word knee one time because I had learned a couple of days before one of the early sessions in our group that I was going to have my knee replaced. And so I had a dream. And in this dream, I was very happy with my group, such as this group now that's watching here. And so we were all at a party, and there was a white limousine. The door of the limousine was open. I was standing outside the limousine because one of our members was missing, and the rest were in the limousine, and I was about to get in this limousine for our party. But then I realized that the other member, whose name was Albert, was being taken away by Nazis and thrown into the back of a Nazi truck, like you would have seen in The Great Escape. And he's calling out for help. And so that member of our group, my association was that was my knee getting taken away. But the image in my dream wasn't a knee, and obviously the doctors weren't Nazis because they did a perfectly fine job of replacing my knee for me. But and so it's just a guess to read the associations of knee in this book, which have nothing to do with my knee, Albert, although we have running joke in the local group. By the way, we'll be having our meeting with the local group on next Monday at Sammy's. But local group, and they always ask me how Albert is these days. So anyway, that's so we've started on the transcendent function, and the idea is being able to get consciousness between the conscious and the unconscious part of your psyche. That's the objective here. And so let's see, what else have we got? Polly says peace. Miles says I had peace. Miles says I had recurring dreams as a child of a moose being present. Kids nicknamed me Moose, and I have a postcard story with a moose on it. Haha. Well, I'm sure we all have talismans like that. Sean says, did you watch Rocky and Bullwinkle? Yeah, when I was a little kid, Rocky and Bullwinkle were in their first run through. But you're asking Miles. Alternatively, I suppose it's easier for me to deal with as opposed to if it was a beaver. Yeah, I would think. Mallory says, Robert Johnson's book, Inner Work, has a great section on the vast possibilities of symbol interpretation. And Sean says, very cool knee story. I find that some of my intuition on dreams is relative how you explained it, is relative to how you explained it. I hope that's useful. But in that case, because I've been doing this a long time, I had pretty much figured out that it was my knee, and so when I read the knee write-up in the symbols book, I already knew that Albert was my knee, and even though he was being taken away by Nazis, and my unconscious was not happy about that, the reality, you have to examine the spirits and understand that while your unconscious may be uncomfortable with the idea that you need a surgical procedure, it might be just what the doctor ordered. So anyway, so that was a compensation, I'm sure, which was sort of playing out my unconscious discomfort with the idea that I would have to have my knee replaced. Okay, so I'm going to discontinue for tonight. I'm sorry I got a late start today, but tomorrow I will come back and try to finish with part 2, and then we'll have this essay down for purposes of Monday night, or it'll actually be Monday a week, because I had a request from the Monday night group to get into the transcendent function. So I will talk about it in Monday night group a week from Monday. And this coming Monday, because we'll be at Sammy's, we'll be mainly just talking about quotations and general observations about Jungian psychology, as we normally do when we're at Sammy's. So, and if any of you are with us on Sammy's, especially you regulars, please do feel free to keep the chat going, because I usually can't follow the chat when I'm trying to broadcast live stream off my iPhone. I will try to take an iPad that will allow me to do it, but usually it's a bust. So anyway, see you soon. Tomorrow I'll try to get the rest of this essay in. Talk to you soon. Time tomorrow. I will try for about 11:30 a.m. That seems to be the most useful time. And because when it gets late like this, then my wife gets after me for not being with her in the evening. So it's now 20 to 7, and I better shut up or I'm not going to have dinner. So, talk to you tomorrow. Bye.